against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the Philistines and into the hand of the Ammonites, and they crushed and oppressed the people of Israel that year. And then for 18 years they oppressed all the people of Israel who were beyond the Jordan in the land of the Ammonites, which is in Gilead. And the Ammonites crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah and against Benjamin and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was severely distressed. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, "We have sinned against you, because we have forsaken our God and have served the Baals." The Lord said to the people of Israel, "Did I not save you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and the Ammonites and from the Philistines? The Sidonians also and the Amalekites and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, and I saved you out of their hand? Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore, I will save you no more. Go and cry out to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them save you in the time of your distress." And the people of Israel said to the Lord, "We have sinned. Do to us what seems good to you. Only please deliver us this day." So they put away the foreign gods from among them, and they served the Lord, and he became impatient over the misery of Israel. And the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped in Gilead, and the people of Israel came together, and they camped at Mizpah. All right, so that's where we're at. What is distinctive about this cry out to the Lord? So we've been hearing this pattern where the people sin, God hands them over to their enemies, they cry to God for deliverance, but there's something different now at that step in this section than previous times when they've cried out to God. Yes, Barb. It comes just before that, and what God says to them. Al.
You want to serve these gods? Let them help you.
Right, so now their cry to distress to God is challenged by God. And God says, "I've rescued you a lot, and you keep turning to these false gods. Apparently, you trust these false gods more than me. Let's see how they do." And so this is kind of that interesting dialogue. We don't know how these kinds of dialogues happen. We don't know when the Lord speaks to Israel what that looks like. We've got the impression that it would be maybe the priest with the ephod speaking from a high place. But we don't know what it means that the Lord spoke to Israel. How did they hear God? But apparently they heard it in such a way that they then spoke back to God. And what's wonderful here is, how do the people respond? Barb pointed that out. And they go, "God, really, we mean it. We want you." And then the response from God to that is to become impatient with their misery. He doesn't want them to be in misery any longer. Howard. Well, there is a sense of how do they hear God, and I pointed to that experience of the ephod and the priest, and a person wearing the ephod, which was this kind of breastplate with stones that would give them the confidence that this person was speaking for God. And their response, it does seem to have kind of that ritual response, and yet God acts with that response. God takes people at their word, and if the people say, "We need help," and God says, "Are you sure?" and they say, "Yeah, really, this isn't going to be a Minnesota goodbye. That, all right, it's time to go. Are you sure? Let's talk in the living room, let's talk at the door, let's talk at the driveway, let's talk at the car door." No, God's like, "All right, you say you need me. You sure?" "Yes, we need you." He acts. Yeah.
Just one thing I realized when I went through this study, we don't hear about the tabernacle apparently in process the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
That the people must be supporting it, and some people are showing up.
Right, there's a remnant. Somewhere people are hearing the voice of God.
Right, and even though God acts otherwise, like I don't think we hear about a high priest between Eleazar and Eli, which is a couple centuries, but they must have been in ministry.
Yeah, there's some sort of ministry that's happening to have that people know where to go when they cry to God and where to go to hear that word of God. All right, we're now going to continue reading, and in this section of the remainder of chapter 10, we're going to just see this kind of marshaling that happens. So from verse 17 through 11:11. Then the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped in Gilead. And the people of Israel came together, and they encamped at Mizpah. The people, the leaders of Gilead, said to one another, "Who is this man who will begin to fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over all of the inhabitants of Gilead." Now Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. And worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him. And after a time the Ammonites made war against Israel. And when the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob. And they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites." But Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "Did you not hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now, when you are in distress?" And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "That is why we have turned to you now, that you may go with us and fight against the Ammonites and be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "If you bring me home again to fight against the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, I will be your head." And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "The Lord will be witnesses between us, if we do not do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over them. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah. So, first, kind of a generic question for each of you. When you are in a heap of trouble, who do you call? So, maybe it depends on the situation. You got car trouble, who do you call? AAA, all right. Who still has AAA? All right, there's a handful of you. More than 50% of you still have AAA. Yeah. It's interesting. We don't have AAA, but with our car insurance, we pay an extra $5, and Farm Bureau has someone. But sometimes we'll just say we're going to call AAA. It's almost become like Kleenex for us. You know, that brand name that becomes a generic. All right, so you might call it car trouble. You call AAA. I know when my boys are in car trouble, they usually will call me first. And then I'll try to figure out what to do next. What other kind of trouble might you get in where you got to call someone else for help? Health trouble? And who would you call then, Howard? Your doctor? Yeah, your doctor's office? Okay. Sometimes we call the designated person, sometimes we call someone else. Barb, if you're in health trouble, who do you call? Oh, that's right. You're like the parish nurse. We could give you that title with all the pay that comes with it. Yes. It's interesting how coaches are always supposed to be the one that goes out to the field and provide first aid to the kid that's knocked down. Mark, have you coached sports where you've been kind of asked to be that coach that comes out and diagnose what's wrong? It's like, I don't know. I slept at Holiday Inn last night. I guess I know what went wrong. So sometimes we call the designated person. Sometimes we call someone else. What do we learn about Jephthah's upbringing, and how might that upbringing have affected his personality? So what do we know about Jephthah? Right off the bat, it says his mother is what? He's the son of a prostitute, and his father has other sons with a wife. And what's the attitude of those sons? Get rid of him. He doesn't deserve any inheritance. And when the town calls him back, Jephthah takes what happened to him not as just a family issue, but as a town issue. It's kind of an interesting thing where you realize that the interaction between Jephthah's family and the town are seen as one. And that happens sometimes in our school. something might happen and someone will say, the school did this. I'm like, I don't know how you categorize the whole school did it. I mean, one parent said something to you, but sometimes they get categorized in broad spectrum together. Just making sure, let's see. Someone texted me. I want to make sure that the stream is right. Terry did the right thing, okay. You don't think it's streaming? Let's see. Oh, what did you turn off? Okay. It is recording? All right, we'll go with that then. Yeah. Yeah, the stream continues. Okay, we'll just survive. Who seemed to be the closest friends and companions of Jephthah? So this comes up in verse 3. Worthless fellows. Because that's pretty much, why did that happen to Jephthah? Got kicked out of his family. He doesn't have the family fellows, so he starts hanging out with all the other outcasts. And there becomes this kind of collection of fools, I suppose, that happens. When he went into battle, do you think he trusted the elders of Israel to keep their word? Let's look at when the elders of Gilead call him to town and say, we need you. I want you to look at verse 10 and to figure out how do they try to build trust with Jephthah. What do they say will help secure the bond? Tammy? Yeah, so they call God down from on high to be a witness to this bond that is being formed between the people of Gilead and Jephthah. And so this is kind of an interesting thing as we try to think about how did they know God? Well, they know God well enough that if you break your vow and God is a witness, that's an interesting thing to look at.
Aren't they at this point where Jacob and his father-in-law say, God, watch between us, because we can't trust each other, so God's our witness?
Yes, Mitzvah becomes this place of covenant making, and it becomes this spot of conviction, so that it's not only the words that are said, but it's the location where it's said that becomes significant. And then you'll see then in verse 11, when Jephthah speaks, it says he not only speaks to the people, but he's speaking before the Lord. And so now the Lord has become bonded to this effort as well. What were the people risking if they let Jephthah lead them? So they're looking for a leader for battle. What's the risk to them when they go and retrieve Jephthah from the land of Tob? Right, so they're going to this outcast, and if God's not with Jephthah, then you don't go to Jephthah if he's your first choice. Like, they've looked around and they realize, not him, not him, not him. We've got nobody here. We've got to go somewhere else. It's requiring them to draft someone into this because there's no one that's on the roster right now. What do you see?
But there are a couple of points. One is he could have said no.
Mm-hmm.
The other is he could have said yes, and then these people were nice to me, want me to get out of the way, but it happens he could win on it. And finally, if they won, there's always that fear of now he's in charge, retribution's coming from the way we treated him, now he's going to seek revenge on us.
That's the full package right there. If Jephthah's victorious, now he's in power to bring his judgment against everyone that did him wrong. But there's some confidence that he's the guy. And they know that he's the guy because, it says about him that he is great. Verse 1, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. He's got that identity. All right, we're going to now read 12 through 28 and realize that Jephthah a lot of weight has been put on his shoulders. And he's going to be able to be successful if he doesn't carry that weight by himself, but if he goes with God. Then Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites and said, "What do you have against me, that you have come to me to fight against my land?" And the king of the Ammonites answered the messengers of Jephthah, "Because Israel, on coming up from Egypt, took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok and to the Jordan, now therefore restore it peaceably." Jephthah again sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites and said to him, "Thus says Jephthah, Israel did not take away the land of Moab or the land of Ammonites, but when they came up from Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and came to Kadesh. Israel then sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, 'Please let us pass through your land,' but the king of Edom would not listen. And they sent also to the king of Moab, but he would not consent. So Israel remained at Kadesh. Then they journeyed through the wilderness and went around the land of Edom and the land of Moab, and arrived on the east side of the land of Moab, and camped on the other side of the Arnon. But they did not enter the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was the boundary of Moab. Israel then sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, king of Heshbon, and Israel said to him, "Please, let us pass through your land to our country." But Sihon did not trust Israel to pass through his territory, so Sihon gathered all his people together and camped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. And the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and all his people into the land of Israel, and they defeated him. I got distracted with my microphone, and I got to find my spot again. End of verse 21. So Israel took possession of the land and of the Amorites who inhabited that country. They took possession of all the territory of the Amorites from the Arnon to the Jabbok and from the wilderness to the Jordan. So then the Lord, the God of Israel, dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. And are you to take possession of them? Will you not possess what Chemosh your God gives you to possess? And all that the Lord our God has dispossessed before us, we will possess. Now, are you any better than Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever contend against Israel, or did he even go to war with them? While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aor and its villages, and all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years. Why did you not deliver them within that time? I therefore have not sinned against you, and you did me wrong by making war on me. The Lord, the judge, decide this day between the people of Israel and the people of Ammon." But the king of the Ammonites did not listen to the words of Jephthah that he sent to him. Why this history lesson? It's 300 years after all these events of the arrival of the people of Israel. And this movement through this land, this asking for permission to go through the Amorite land, this asking for permission to go through the Moabite land, and them going around taking the long way, this battle, the Lord driving up the people that were... Why does he go through this history lesson that happened 300 years ago? Right. So Jephthah's going to speak the truth and show that there's a reason for defense. This land that we are in, that you are fighting us against, this is the land that the Lord has given to us. You've got your land. Why didn't you deal with this a long time ago? Yeah, I love that answer of dealing with that. Yeah, Bill.
One thing that confuses me is that here you got a promise to Abraham that he was going to be given the land. And so then you So why is it that it's only Judah that the land is given to her, the Israelites, the northern tribes, and not the Edomites and the Moabites and so on?
Why does Abraham get the covenant and not the other people?
Well, but they're all part of Abraham.
No, they're not.
They're not?
Moabites come from Lot.
Yeah, right.
But it's Abraham's family. But the possession of the covenant is given by Abraham to Isaac, not to Lot. Shirt-tail relatives don't get to sit at the dinner table. They're at the kids' table. This is the challenge, I suppose, of them, is they're like, we have the right to be here. And Jephthah is like, no, you don't. Where we're at, this conflict, this war, is wrong. And so I think one of the benefits of this letter is to show the reason for the justness of Israel to stand up for themselves. And that there is, he is essentially saying to the Ammonites, you've got your space, you came into ours, and that's where the problems come from. Your time went badly for so many years because you overstepped. And now you're trying to overstep again. All right. So he looks at how we tried to go through your land. You wouldn't give us permission. That's one of the arguments. We went around, and yet you still were troublesome. And now, even now, after 300 years, you're trying to do something that you have had plenty of time to do. So those are kind of the three arguments that they build on. Question 10. Why do you think the king of the people of Ammon doesn't listen?
He's been kicking Israel's butt for 18 years.
Yeah, why listen to Jephthah? What power does Jephthah have to speak any of these words? So he doesn't need to listen, he thinks. The person in power doesn't need to listen to the person who has no power. All right. Let's continue to read now in 29 through 40 and see there's this interesting vow that Jephthah makes. Not sure why he makes it, but he does, and we'll see the effects of that. Then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed on to Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So strange. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. He struck them from the Or to the neighborhood of Mineath, 20 cities, and as far as Abel-Keramim, with a great blow. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. And she said to him, my father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites. So she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions. So he said, go. Then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, she and her companions, and wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in the year. The Spirit of the Lord arrives upon Jephthah. The Spirit of God is with him. Was the vow necessary for victory? We don't have a clear answer, by the way, to this question. But it's a strange one. I mean, it's clearly said that the Spirit of the Lord is with him. Why does he make the vow? I don't know. It's the rashness of that overwhelming confidence of like, God is with me, I'm going into battle, God stay with me. It's a strange thing.
Wasn't the sacrifice of people part of the other gods that they were worshiping?
Yeah, Molech especially was known, and Chemosh, both of these gods were known as gods that would receive sacrifices of children.
So I always think of this as being a shortfall of Jephthah, that he really didn't understand Yahweh.
Mm-hmm. And yet God gave him victory nonetheless. Even if Jephthah didn't understand God, with Jephthah making this rash vow, mm-hmm. Well, so kind of building on your question of substitute, Genesis 22, the ram is provided by God in the thicket, so that Isaac isn't offered up as a sacrifice.
I know it's there. It's one of the things, every time I look at this unordered list, I always can't find it. But there is there, and a man, like regard to Herod's birthday, there was a way out, but you've got to go admit you screwed up big publicly.
You could also be redeemed by a Levite, and then a lifetime of service with the Levites, and that's found in Numbers 3, 11 through 13. So that's where you are going to offer your life as a sacrifice, and instead a Levite stands in your place and serves in the priesthood. It's not clear exactly what happens to Jephthah. He has made this offering as a sacrifice. It says in verse 39, at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. It would appear that he had offered her as a burnt offering, and it would have seemed to be quite suitable that if he offered an animal in her place as a substitute, that there could have been a way around it. We're going to kind of look at a question of Gideon, because I want you to see, is Gideon different? And so I think it's in 6, where Gideon also he makes a vow as well. And so Gideon, the call of Gideon, and Gideon has all sorts of exchanges with God. And so you've got this sense of conversation between Jephthah and God. You got the conversation between Gideon and God. So 6 through 8 we got Gideon. But Jephthah makes this vow, but we never hear of Jephthah talking to God again. So I think my question is, what's the difference between Jephthah and Gideon? Gideon continues to talk to God and said, if you do this, then I'll do this. There's this kind of conversation of movement of the fleece and the army, and this Gideon's got this confidence, I can talk to God. Jephthah makes a vow, but we find no further time of Jephthah talking to God. And so there's kind of this sense of maybe Jephthah thinking that there's only one course. Another way to think of this is when God says about Sodom and Gomorrah, he's going to destroy Sodom. And you remember Abram on the hill talking to God and said, if there's 50 righteous, if there's 30, if there's 20, if there's 10 righteous. That Abraham and Gideon, they show this pattern of people of faith knowing how to talk to God. But Jephthah, he doesn't. It's a strange story. And I think it's sometimes helpful to say that rash vows make rash results. And before anyone says, I'm going to do this, I swear to God, it's kind of a lesson of be careful what you swear. Janet. Yeah. And I think that's the big mistake of Jephthah, is that he doesn't show the boldness of being able to talk to God. That's what the Psalms are about, are filled with conversation of God, I'm suffering, I need to talk to you. Jephthah doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it exactly, Janet. That's the sadness of Jephthah. Jephthah 11:1 starts, he was a mighty warrior, but he misses something. All right, we're going to now continue on in chapter 12. And we're going to see Jephthah and his conflict with the people of Ephraim. The men of Ephraim were called to arms, and they crossed over to Zaphon and said to Jephthah, "Why did you cross over to fight against the Ammonites and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house over you with fire." And Jephthah said to them, "I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. And when I saw that you would not save me, I took my life in my hand, and I crossed over against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me?" Then Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim. And the men of Gilead struck Ephraim, because they said, "You are fugitives of Ephraim, you Gileadites, in the midst of Ephraim and Manasseh." And the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. And when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead said to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And when they said no, they said to him, "Then say Shibboleth." And he said Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they seized him and slaughtered him at the fords of the Jordan. At that time, 42,000 of the Ephraimites fell. Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in his city in Gilead. All right, what seems to be Ephraim's point? We're going to try to understand by comparing chapter 12, 1 through 3 with 8, 1 through 3. So we just read chapter 12, 1 through 3. Ephraimites annoyed that they didn't get to be invited to the battle. And Jephthah said, "I asked you to the battle, you didn't come, so we had to go to the battle on our own." Let's see what happens in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Then the men of Ephraim said to him, "What is this that you have done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they accused him fiercely, and he said to him, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleanings of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezr? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. Why have I been able to do it in comparison with you?" Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. All right, so what happens in 12 is Ephraim said, "Why didn't you invite us?" Jephthah said, I went into battle because you wouldn't come. Then Ephraim and Gilead go against each other in battle. What stopped the civil war in chapter 8? What did Gideon do? Gideon complimented Ephraim, said, "Your gleanings are so great. Even just the empties of your harvest are better than anything else. You guys are a great people." So Jephthah challenges them to battle. Gideon compliments them. Gideon didn't have to compliment them, but he also doesn't need a civil war. Let's look then in 1 through 7. And in the end, why is there this battle between them? What did Ephraim want? In verse 2, what does Jephthah say that Ephraim wanted? So Jephthah said to them, "I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. And when I saw that you would not save me, I took my life in my hand, and I crossed over against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me?" What did you think Ephraim wanted by coming late to the battle? They wanted the spoils. They wanted the credit. And Jephthah wasn't going to let them get any credit. What do you think of the accent test? Did Ephraim have it coming? 42,000 killed because they couldn't say the sh and only said the s. I don't know if it's one of these inter-conflicts that just seems so unnecessary. There's a sadness to me about it. And the Ephraimites, I mean, they do lie. When they're asked, are you an Ephraimite? They say no. I mean, they could have said yes. We don't find out what happens to any of the Ephraimites that, when questioned and crossing the ford, are you an Ephraimite? And if they would have said yes, what would have happened? I mean, they did lie, and they got caught in their lie. It's one of those stories that you read and you realize that the people of Israel are real people. Oh, microphones. All right, we're going to look now at 8 through 15. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters he gave in marriage outside his clan, and 30 daughters he brought in from outside for his sons. And he judged Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem. After him, Elon the Zebulunite judged Israel, and he judged Israel 10 years. Then Elon the Zebulunite died and was buried at Ajalon in the land of Zebulun. After him, Abdon, the son of Hillel the Pirathonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys, and he judged Israel 8 years. Then Abdon, the son of Hillel the Pirathonite, died and was buried at Pirathon in the land of Ephraim in the hill country of the Amalekites. What do we know about these guys? Lots of kids. And none of their kids became the next judge, which is different than after Gideon and Abimelech killed the 70 sons, and he brought himself up as one of the judges. So there's this, seems to be this recognition that as many kids as they may have, we can go elsewhere. That the judge doesn't have to come from one of them. What's to be praised? What's to be questioned? What will you question about these men? What do you think? I don't know if that's a good thing. I don't know if I want to imitate that. Value judgment. I'm not sure how a guy gets 30 sons and 30 daughters unless he's got a lot of wives. I might not want to imitate that. Then, how about if you're a daughter, married out, married in?
Depends if it was her idea.
Yeah.
Just dynastic marriage or just, well, we're living on the border. There's this nice guy in the next village I live up by, and he's in private Dan. Who cares?
Mm-hmm.
If it's a matter of this is dynastic marriage, or based on the women being treated like cattle, another issue.
Yeah. There's nothing that's all that positive mentioned about them. There's not like, and they did this, or they did that, or they restored this. It's kind of neutral terms.
There's also nothing that says in Israel went the wrong way.
Right. So from judge to judge, they're not from the same family, so they've got that sense, Israel does, of not looking just from generational transfer of power, but to look for who God raises up. Their rule isn't for that long, 7 years, 10 years, 8 years. But there's not this incredible degradation of the land or anything that happens with them. If you could choose something to be remembered about you, what would it be? So, you've got Ibzan of Bethlehem. He's remembered by the fact that he successfully married 30 daughters out and got 30 daughters in. So if I mean, at the end of it, is maybe if it could be remembered that I successfully arranged marriages for my kids, that wouldn't be so bad, I guess. They might question that. No, there's no mention of the Lord about them. Yeah, so that's something you would want to have remembered about you, Terry. That's the reason you're here, yeah.
Well, there's one other difference, foreshadowing. Now in Samuel, one of the reasons people want a king is Samuel's sons are worthless. They say, we don't want them in charge.
Yeah. Eli's sons had been in trouble, Samuel's sons had been in trouble, and they look for Saul. They look for a king.
Yeah, give us a king rather than, well, wait a minute. Your sons are worthless, okay, God's got somebody else in.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go through seminary and you run into, hey, you got to be able to teach about the judges, the period of the judges. What are you going to tell your people who are supposed to learn from this? I mean, is it just to say that, hey, you know, leadership isn't always all that good?
I would take from the book of Judges, and this is where you can look at a broad brush and make a claim, and it gets a little bit more tricky when you look at chapter 12, 8 through 15, and what do you say about this verse? Broad spectrum, I would say things go well when the people remember God. When they forget God, they're handed over to their enemies. And when you're in a time of distress, you should cry up to God and trust that God will raise up a judge to deliver you, and that yet even as much as God continually raises up judges to deliver the people, any earthly judge, any deliverer, only has a certain amount of time when he can lead the people. And his time of leadership will come to a close. And as much as he's built up his 30 sons and his 30 daughters, he did not build up something that went for his family longer than that. And it took another judge to lead for another 10 years, and another judge to lead for another 8 years. And each of these judges only had what they could do in their lifespan, and yet God's people continued to sin. That ultimately, the book of Judges is going to show us our earthly rulers are limited in their success, and that our aim should always be to look ahead to what God accomplishes through his own Son. I can have that broad brush, and I still find Jephthah's vow kind of strange. So I can have that broad brush about the book of Judges and still say, I'm not sure why Ibzan of Bethlehem is in this holy writ of Scripture. This is the tough thing of looking at a whole book versus looking at a verse. It's hard sometimes to say, why should someone remember who Ibzan of Bethlehem is? I don't know. And I think that's okay to say too. I think that's one thing they said at seminary is you don't have to have the perfect answer for every question. Yeah. That's a good point, that maybe one of the things is an argument by negative. What is Jephthah missing as he grows up? He misses growing up with a family, and he ends up becoming a great warrior, but at what cost? And we think about how important it is for a family to share with the people within its family the confidence that God will be with you where you go. And Jephthah knows that God is with him because he's, by his hands, successful. But he doesn't, like Gideon, know how to talk to God. Gideon's relationship to his father is mentioned more than once. We don't hear anything about Jephthah and his relationship with his father. Yeah, like the Jets in West Side Story. There's no fathers in West Side Story. Where are all the parents? Yeah. So that gets us through Judges chapter 12 up through the end of chapter 12. We'll begin with the birth of Samson. Samson is going to take this long section, and he goes up through the end of chapter 16. So we'll be looking at Samson next week. And I think it is helpful to kind of sometimes go a little bit by verse, but for Samson, I encourage you on your own this week to maybe read 13 through 16, because we're going to go maybe a little bit faster in some of the sections of Samson rather than verse by verse. So you can help your own study if you read Samson this week. Let's now close with prayer. O Lord, forgive us for our idolatry, those ways in which we exalt our own opinions and our own preferences and hold to them rather than to your holy word. Give to us confidence this day and each of our days that we can talk to you and that you will always listen to us. In the name of Jesus, amen. Have a blessed day.